Hi guys, almost at the end of the year, so I am starting to get into countdown mode for Christmas, which I'm sure a lot of you out there probably are as well. But be that as it may, there's still a heap of stuff going on. So looking at my notes, because this is one of these ones where I need lots of notes, I was at McAfee in Sydney this week. So at least I was at the McAfee Empower event. So this was actually a pretty cool event. They put on a pretty big show. I did a keynote there early in the morning, which went really well. Very, very happy about this. I did the rise of the data breaches, which was very similar to what I did for VMware, only about the week before actually, but different audience, heap of stuff there, around different data breach things. So I was talking a lot about stuff like, obviously the prevalence at which data is leaked, some of the specific incidents. So, you know, here's what we saw with the Red Cross data breach last year. Here's what we saw with CloudPets. CloudPets keeps on giving as well. There's so much material there. And I talked a little bit about things like bug bounties and vulnerability disclosure policies and basically stuff that I hope gets people thinking more about security, the types of folks who maybe don't always think about things like data breaches. And something like a McAfee event, I imagine there are a lot of enterprisey people there who think a lot about endpoints and clients and who don't necessarily always think a lot about the way data breaches happen with systems like the ones I just mentioned. So anyway, that was McAfee. That's done. That was a nice little local trip. Next week, I have an even more local trip in that I am going to the Central Queensland University in Rockhampton in Australia. And they said, look, I'm welcome to sort of talk about where I'm going and what I'm doing. So I'm really stoked actually to be going to a university because they're the sorts of places where we really want people to be thinking about InfoSec because they're, you know, influencing the people and they are the people learning about how to build the world's next systems. So that's really cool. And for people in other parts of the world, Rockhampton is in my same state, so it's in Queensland. Now, in case you're thinking, well, it's a state, can't be that far away, we have very, very big states. It's funny because like I know Americans like to say, oh, Texas is really big. Nah, it's not like here. So it's actually about an hour flight away. In fact, I've got to drive an hour to the airport. I can't go from my local airport. Drive an hour up to Brisbane, then fly to Rockhampton on a little plane. And then I'll be there doing the cyber things with them on Thursday and Friday this week. And I'm really looking forward to this actually. And in fact, we organised this a couple of months back. And I was thinking, you know, it's nice, like we're getting to the end of the year. I can do something really local. I've never actually been to Rockhampton before either. And I thought, okay, well, this will be cool. I'll go somewhere new. And this will be a nice way to sort of gradually, gently end the year without anything sort of too high profile or too stressful. I have totally screwed up that objective because there is this thing that I will be doing the week after that, which is the thing I've mentioned a couple of times so far, which I can't talk about yet. I should be able to talk about it in next week's update, and I should have a blog post I can push out about this around about the middle of next week. It is totally epic. It's off the scale, awesome, and not something that I ever expected to do. You'll see why I'm saying that when I make that announcement next week. As part of that, I also actually had to go and get presentable clothing. And I'll talk about this more later on. But I actually realized that there are certain environments in the world where one needs to be a little bit more presentable than what I normally am in this normal form and what I normally am in pretty much everything else I do. And it actually dawned on me only this week when I had to go shopping that I really have like literally nothing, even socks that are presentable. And I know this sounds really weird, but again, this will sort of make more sense as things unfold. So yeah, that's going to be a cool one. But we'll talk about that in detail next week because it is epic. And then particularly the week after this is already over, I'll be able to talk about exactly what that experience was like. And also everyone will be able to see this as well, the actual event. But again, I'll come back to that a little bit later on. So there's that. Now, also moving on, last week when I did my update, I was talking about the ThinkPad prize that I was giving away as part of that initiative of do something awesome with Have I Been Pwned? And of course, giving this away courtesy of Lenovo as well. They've come up with one of these retro ThinkPads. That has been run and won. So last week when I did my update, there were 4 people who had projects that people were voting on. It has been won by a guy called Felix Giffard, who created a project at passwordsecurity.info. And I gave a bit of an overview of that last week, which is a website where you can go and search, and then it plugs into the Have I Been Pwned API to look at the pwned passwords. And sorry, when I say go and search, you can put a password in and it will look at a combination of the Have I Been Pwned passwords, as well as strength indicators for the password. And it will sort of combine these things together to give people a really good idea of whether they should be using the password or not. And I had it up there in the top 4 because it was just a really neat augmented implementation of different things to do something really useful. So Felix won that on his own merit against the other 4, which was really awesome. After he won it, I also learned that he's 16 years old. And like somehow that just raised the epicness, to another degree. He's 16 years old. He'd been doing JavaScript for like 3 weeks. He does seem to be an exceptionally intelligent young bloke as well, based on the comments from some other people, which is really good. I'm actually really stoked. I didn't know he was 16 before running the competition and before putting the thing out, so I didn't have any sort of unconscious bias, which is great. And I'm super stoked I learned afterwards that he is 16 as well, because I just think it's like these are the people we really want doing super awesome stuff, because a little bit like the university thing before, they're going to influence the design of so many systems in the future and influence their peers and their attitude towards the way we build software as well. So I'm really stoked about that. Lenovo is now chatting with him to make sure he gets that machine. And I'd love to follow up later on, Felix, if you're watching this, and see what you've actually done with it as well. Because I hope it's sort of something that helps you go and do more awesome things in the future. Okay, so there's that. Now, there is something else. I've got to watch when I look at this. There, which is this. Now, for those of you listening, this in my hand is an iPhone X, iPhone 10. I'm still not really sure. It has finally arrived yesterday, which is cool. I pre-ordered it the day they opened, and it took, I don't know, when did these launch? 2 or 3 weeks ago. So not too bad, but I thought I'd give everyone a bit of a sort of first-hand overview of what I'm thinking about the device, or how I'm feeling about the device. Because, I mean, look, let's face it, there's been a lot of controversy over this iPhone. Everything from the notch thing at the top, which I'll talk about in a moment, through to Face ID, which we'll definitely go into some detail on. Now, caveats first, I set this up yesterday afternoon, so I've been playing with this for less than a day, and a lot of this is sort of first impressions. Some good, some bad, some in the middle. Now, I made a few notes because I want to sort of make sure I hit some key points here. And the first note here was that, look, I've had a lot of iPhones, right? So I'm talking to you on my old iPhone 7 Plus so that I can show you the other one separately. And what I've found is that every time I've had an iPhone and I've migrated from one to the other, it's been a slick experience. And particularly in recent years, when we've had iCloud, basically my sort of migration process has been make sure that this one, the old one, has backed up to iCloud, get the new one, connect it, download the things from iCloud, wait a little while the data comes down, job done, we're there. What I noticed this time, and I assume this is an iOS 11 feature as opposed to an iPhone 10 per se feature, is that when I started setting up the new one, it says, hey, put the old one in close proximity and we'll make some stuff easier for you. And I did that, and what it did is it showed on my new iPhone, where are we here? There we go. On my new iPhone, it sort of showed a few things on the screen. It showed like a little image of like a little sort of animated image. It said point the camera of the old phone at this one just so that we can ensure that you do have proximity and you do own the device. And then it transferred stuff like my Wi-Fi settings, which is great. So the new one just banged straight into the local Wi-Fi without having to enter credentials. That was very smooth. Then the usual sort of authenticate to iCloud stuff and wait. But it did make the process that extra bit easier. And then when it finished, and I tweeted about this last night too, because it was kind of cool, I had set a timer running on my old phone because I was cooking ribs, which by the way were awesome. And when I did the migration, even the timer was still like perfectly synchronized on the 10. And look, I know that there are a bunch of people out there that love to give Apple shit. And there's a bunch of people that give everyone shit. So let's, call it as it is. But you really can't fault how smooth that experience is. Like that migration between the devices is just super slick. So I've been really, really happy with that. That bit was great. Now, moving on to the mechanics of sort of how I feel about this device. So size-wise, I mean, everyone's probably seen the dimensions and specs, everyone who's interested, as it relates to the other previous devices. What's kind of cool about this is that if I think back to when I first got the Plus phone, so I had an iPhone 6 Plus just after they launched, and I really wanted the extra screen real estate because I do a lot of stuff with my device. I mean, I do a huge amount of work on these phones. And the extra screen real estate, everything from sort of emails and tweets through to the fact I do actually RDP into machines sometimes, you know, and having more real estate is cool for that. So that was great. But at the time, I remember very clearly saying I've got a little bit of buyer's remorse because of the physical dimensions of the phone. And this one that I'm looking at the moment is a big sucker. So it's a big sucker in terms of everything from the pockets that it will fit into through to actually being able to reach my thumb and my fingers and things all across the device. And I always, even to this day, that was the thing that kind of bugged me. It's like, if I could get somewhere between a normal sized phone, like say an iPhone 6 and an iPhone 6 Plus, I'd be happy. But of course, you'd compromise on screen. What's great about the 10 is that it's got effectively the same number of pixels on it as what the Plus does, which is great, but it is physically significantly smaller. Like when I hold this in my hand, it really strikes me every time. It's like, well, this is actually a much smaller phone. So that's awesome. When I sat this next to my wife's iPhone 7, the dimensions are almost identical, like very, very close. The 10 is just fractionally small, larger rather. So a big whack smaller than the Plus, a tiny fraction larger than the normal mainstream size, but more pixels, or about the same pixels. So that's great. Like to me, that's a win, right? Like that's just everything I want. Easier to handle, don't compromise on screen real estate. Now, having said that, obviously the way they've done that, and I'm still getting used to even unlocking this thing, the way they've done that is to do this sort of whole full screen thing where there is no longer a home icon, or a home button rather. Now, because there's no home button, obviously that changes the way that you interact with it. And I have now gone for not quite 10 years, because I didn't have the first 1 or 2 generations. I think we didn't get iPhones in Australia till about Gen 3. So let's say about 8 years. I've gone for about 8 years, always click on the home button to close an app, or more recently to switch apps or do things like that. And that's gone. So now it is all gesture based. So you literally have to swipe up and across, or vertically to the top, northeast, in order to do switching. If you want to get to the control panel, you've got to swipe sort of southwest down from the top right corner. So you've got to do all of these things and learn gestures which are different to the way they worked before. Now, on the one hand, it's a bit of a pain in the ass because there's a learning curve. On the other hand, as I'm starting to pick this up, I'm like, well, actually, this is all kind of really intuitive. And so long as I swipe correctly and I don't sort of go, sort of half a centimetre too far one way and it doesn't quite pick it up, it's good. But there is a bit of a learning curve I've got to get used to there. Now, actually, looking at this, as I say curves, one of the things that you'll notice here is that the corners are no longer square. So on the old devices where they sort of chopped it on the top and there was obviously a big bezel on the top, and chopped it on the bottom, there was a big bezel, you could square off the corners. All the corners now are very, very round. In fact, they're round with a pretty significant radius as well. And in a way, it kind of feels odd because you're looking at the corners going, I'm used to a rectangular screen, and now it's not really a rectangle. But having said that, it really depends on what you're looking at in that app in terms of whether that's a problem or not. So I'll try and find something I can possibly show on here that illustrates that. So if I look at, say, what I was looking at before? Skype. So if I was looking at Skype. Now Skype frankly bugs me in a number of ways at the best of times. But Skype, if I go to say, let me see, what's something I can show? Let me see if I can show the dial pad. Good example. Oh no, that's all black. Let's go to... Incidentally, I'm always conscious, like I know there are flashes of my watch, and I know there are flashes of my screen and things like that. And every now and then someone says, oh, you know, you got to be careful because someone's going to see something on your screen that's going to be really super sensitive. And I try very hard not to put super sensitive things on there, and I do watch the videos very carefully before I publish them. Every now and then I slip a little Easter egg in too. All right, here's a good example. So here is Skype on the device. Now, for those of you that can see this, you'll see there's a lot of black space at the top and at the bottom. And effectively what's happening here is this is not filling up all the vertical space it has. Because not only are there now rounded corners at the top, but the dimensions have changed, or the aspect ratio has changed, where it's now that little bit higher than what it was before. So what you've got, and this actually reminds me of when we went sort of iPhone 4 Gen to iPhone 5 and the phones got higher. So what you've got is that when you look at something like this, you go, oh, there's this kind of like this unused space at the top, which feels like a bit of a waste. But then you look at an app which is actually doing a good job of using all that space. And if I just go to, let's say if I go to like my latest followers in Twitter, when you actually have something that does use all the space, and if you see my profile photo, latest followers, latest tweets of people I'm following, and you look at my profile photo, we see all the way at the top left-hand side of the screen, my face is actually there and it's using the space. So when I look at that, I kind of go, okay, well, once an app is actually designed to use all the vertical space, well, this is good. We fill out a lot of room. But even then, like I look at the bottom of it and go, there's a lot of wasted space under the icons all the way down the bottom. Like it just feels like that is not quite as slick as it should be. Now, the other thing, of course, that's very controversial is what they call that notch at the top of the screen. So when you look at the top and you see that there's a sort of black descending bar right in the middle, and I just noticed this is kind of cool. When I do that, I can see the infrared light flashing on my other phone. So we'll come back to infrared and what that means in just a moment. But you have a look at the notch itself, and it's like, okay, first of all, there's a whack of the screen that's been taken out for what feels like no good reason. Now, of course, there is a good reason because you've got to put the camera somewhere, and it's not just the camera, it's the depth sensor, and it's the infrared camera and all this sort of stuff. So they needed somewhere to put all of this stuff, which kind of made sense. Which, you know, inevitably it has to be somewhere forward facing. And if you want to try and fill the screen out to all the available space, you're going to have to take a chunk out of it. So, you know, they've done that, which I can understand. And if I'm honest, the notch itself doesn't particularly bug me. The bit that bugs me is that when you look at the icons next to the notch, it just doesn't feel like, I don't know, it's just aesthetically not quite right. They feel like they're jammed in a little bit right. They don't feel sort of equidistant from the edge and the top. The other thing that I've realized, and this is a definite negative, is that I cannot see the percentage of battery available anymore. So when you look at the battery here, and I know that this is probably not focused as well on the screen as it probably could be, I've just got the bar. Now you could always tailor this, right? Like you could tweak it. So on previous iPhones, you could go into the battery settings and you could say, I would like to see the percentage on the battery. But now, because there's not as much room, you no longer have the option to show the percentage on the battery, so I don't know exactly what percentage of my battery is left. And that is kind of disappointing because that's something I actually used a lot. But having said that, maybe now that I don't have it and I'll get used to it, and maybe it actually won't matter that much and it was just something that I missed because it was just always there but didn't possibly provide me a lot of value. Now, incidentally as well, and I'm trying to remember which app it was, but I was using an app before that did actually fill out all the space in the notch as well, like the gaps next to the notch. And that actually looked pretty neat, and particularly when it was using that well. I think it was a map, but I just checked and it's not actually Google Maps. We might actually try Apple Maps and see if it does it there. But when that app fills out that space and it uses it well, it actually felt pretty good. Now, incidentally, if I do open Apple Maps, yeah, actually, you know what? Apple Maps is pretty neat. So here's Apple Maps, and it's blur affecting what's actually under that top right-hand corner and top left-hand corner in the notch. But even so, it actually, you know, to me that works pretty well, right? Like it's using the space effectively. So I'm okay with that. Okay, now, Face ID. Let's have the Face ID discussion. I wrote about Face ID after they launched it, right after they launched it, obviously before I'd used it. And the premise that I was sort of writing about here was, yeah, some people were losing their minds about the fact that there is a Face ID thing. Because they're like, you know, Either Apple's going to steal your faces, or you're going to have problems with biometrics due to other reasons. And I was giving examples where people saying stuff like, if you use biometrics, because in the US they can apparently legally compel you to unlock your device if you have biometrics, but not if you have just a PIN, you could have a situation where, let's say, the police are shooting the person that you're with. Yes, I know, but bear with me. So the police are shooting the person that you're with, and then you're filming it on your iPhone at the time where they're shooting the person, and then the cops come over and they say, we would like your iPhone so that we can delete evidence, which, by the way, I'm pretty sure is illegal everywhere. We'd like to go and delete evidence. Because you're using biometrics, we can legally ask you to unlock the phone so that we can illegally delete the evidence of us illegally shooting the dude that you're with. But if it was a PIN, then they couldn't legally compel you to do it, and you'd be okay. and this was like the argument. This is the argument against biometrics, which makes absolutely no sense in the world. Because if you're a police officer shooting people and then illegally deleting evidence, you're probably not going to go, well, we were going to get the PIN from the person, but they said no, so now we can't actually just beat them over the head with a bat until they give it to us, or just take their phone. You know, so it's just like they're bullshit arguments. So in real world terms, in terms of, first of all, the efficacy, if you want, so how effective it is to actually use. To me, like, this is pretty much as seamless as Touch ID. I know people have measured it and gone, there's like a 50 millisecond difference or something. But in real world terms, and we'll try and do this in a way where you can see it, it's like you raise the phone, there's my little guy, raise the phone, swipe it, it's job done, and we're in. And even when if I put it back down on my lap and I try and do it again quickly, it's like, okay, raise the phone, touch it, swipe, we're in. You know, like that is a really slick experience. I was really interested in how it will work when your face looks different. So for example, I was playing tennis this morning. I had pretty full-on wraparound sunglasses and I had a hat. No dramas, opened perfectly every time. I got out of the shower before, picked the phone straight up, swiped, we're good. Now some of those are circumstances where Touch ID was flaky before. So particularly, say, if you got out of the shower or you've been laying in the bath or something like that and your fingers are all, you know, kind of wrinkly, Touch ID dead, not going to work at all. This worked straight away, which was really good. And honestly, I haven't had an occasion so far, regardless of how I'm dressed or what's over my face, within reason, of course, where it hasn't worked. So I'm super, super happy about that. Now, this sort of brings us to the point of, well, how effective is it, right? Like, how easily could it be tricked if it works in all these different circumstances? And there was a bit in the news, it was either earlier this week or late last week, where some folks in Vietnam had a mask, and they said, look, we've built this mask, and then they lift the cover off the mask, and then the Face ID just unlocks. And of course, this sort of got a lot of press because it's a very sensational story. You know, if Apple has gone and created this thing, and then these blokes had a bit of plasticine and a 3D printer, and suddenly they're unlocking it as someone else, well, that is a sensational story. And particularly because Wired had gone out and tried to do the same thing. And Wired created all of these masks and things like this and couldn't get into the device. So how do these blokes in Vietnam do it? Now, it's always interesting when you see stuff like that where it seems a bit sensational because it sort of ends up dividing people into two camps. There's the camp which is like, I told you so, this biometric stuff was never going to be good. And there's the camp which, frankly, I'm a bit more in, which is skepticism. And the skepticism I had was Apple, okay, so let's say regardless of how much for or against biometrics you are or how worried you are about your mate getting shot and then the police taking your phone, regardless of all that, one thing I think everyone can agree on is Apple has invested a shitload of money into building this thing. You know, there's enormous amounts of billions of dollars gone in for every one of these product launches. Huge amounts of research, huge amounts of effort, and a lot of stake riding on its success. The likelihood of someone being able to just wrangle up a mask, pull a cloth off, and that's it, you're in, is not very high. Everyone will agree with this. This is like an immutable fact. It's not like they don't test these things. They have huge amounts of security researchers and all the rest of it. So it was never going to be a likely thing. Now, of course, be that as it may, they did, assuming they didn't fabricate anything, they did get it to work. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that, okay, now Face ID is crap. And Dan Gooden on Ars Technica wrote a really interesting piece sort of saying, well, look, maybe this is not all as it seems. And I made a comment, I think I shared it and made a comment probably just yesterday where I said, look, when you see something that appears really sensational, that's often a pretty good sign that it might actually be really sensational and not true. And I think someone sort of questioned that and went, well, they did actually do it. They managed to pull the mask off. And Dan replied and he said, look, here are some of my questions that are still not answered about how this worked. And I want to touch on these because these are really good questions from Dan, and they change the narrative from is it possible to what were the circumstances that actually made it possible, which is really important. So there's a few questions from Dan here. So one of them, he says, it's still not, and he's actually asking these questions and not getting straight answers, by the way. He says, it's still not clear precisely how you went about conducting this experiment. Were you able to use the mask to unlock the phone immediately after enrolling the real face? And where Dan is going here is Apple's white paper on the whole thing says that, look, it learns more detail about your face over time. So over a period of time, it's going to get more effective at knowing who you are and in theory become more effective at making sure it doesn't unlock for the wrong people. And that's a very important question because if someone just went and did the enrollment, which incidentally was very, very fast, the security profile sounds, based on Apple's information, like it'd be different to many days or weeks or something later on. Now, another one, and this sort of gets really to the point here, he says, please explain precisely what was needed to make the mask. Did you need physical access to the real face? Did you have to measure, touch, or otherwise interact with the real face? Were you able to create the mask simply by taking a picture or video of the face, which is kind of what's being implied, certainly by some people? How did the artist create the nose? Did the artist touch the real nose, take a mold of the real nose, or otherwise interact with it in any way? Now, some people may think these are semantic questions, but they're not. They're very, very important because the answers to those questions is the difference between being able to say, let's say it's a world leader or somewhere, I managed to go and get a good photo of Putin, right? Create a mask, and now I'm in Putin's iPhone, versus I had to capture Putin and hold him down and pour like silicon molds and stuff over his face and then create the mask and everything from there. And we had to touch and feel his nose and model it precisely. The circumstances leading up to the ability to create that mask are absolutely essential. And so far, these guys can't give Dan a straight answer. And that to me is enormously suspicious. Now, he also says here, in fact, he asks here, and he still hasn't had an answer to these, using your technique, what would a real-world attacker have to do to go about creating a mask that unlocked the phone of a billionaire, a corporate leader, a nation leader, or FBI agent? Would the attacker have to have access to the target's actual face, or would a video or picture of that face be enough? And this is really, really important. And these are very, very straight to the point questions that he still can't get answers on. In fact, he goes on and he says, please be as specific as possible and please don't discuss additional matters or opinions until directly answering these questions. Because basically they've gone a little bit Chewbacca defense on a few things here. And if you don't know what that is, Google it. So that there's a lot of sort of misdirection and indirect answering of questions. And, you know, I'm not trying to sort of be an Apple fanboy defendant here because I've got one of the phones. But again, when you look at it really rationally and you go, they would have put massive amounts of effort into this, and some blokes have made a video and they can't explain the circumstances that led up to the creation of the mask, you can see why I'm about as skeptical as what Dan is on this. So, be that as it may, getting back to the device, I haven't tried a bunch of the things which I was intending to try earlier on in terms of like, does it work when you don't have your eyes? You know, let's do that now. So if I close my eyes and I do the phone and I swipe it. Oh, you know, I'm going to do that again just so you see it. All right. So if I close my eyes, lift the phone, touch it, swipe it. All right. Ask for a pin. So, yeah. You're meant to have attention, for example. There's actually a setting in the security where you can go and turn that off. Don't turn that off, by the way. Where you no longer need to have actual attention to it. But that's actually great. And in fact, if I now, so now I've just unlocked it successfully just with a swipe and Face ID. So things like that should be pretty solid. Look, the thing's been out there for weeks. If someone was going to find a really easy, trivial way to break into it, they probably would have now. Maybe they will in the future, but that's obviously going to take a little bit more time than what we've had so far. All right, so bottom line is I'm actually really happy with the phone. I think that's awesome. I haven't really had a chance to play with the camera too much. A little bit of pros and cons in terms of some of the other things, but as far as Face ID goes, my early feeling is that it works fantastically. We haven't seen any credible evidence that it's easily circumvented in any way. And certainly Apple's figures had it as significantly more robust than what Touch ID was. So I'm happy with that. I will tell you if I change my mind later on. Who knows? All right, moving on. In terms of things that I have actually written and actually done this week. Content security policies. So as I announced a little while ago, I've now joined Report URI in terms of helping support that service, which is there to take CSP reports, among other types of reports, and help you understand what is going wrong with your content security policy things, which is really what's going wrong on your website should someone actually be trying to break into the thing. And what I've actually been doing in order to write this post is I wanted to rewrite the CSP on Have I Been Pwned? Because I created it quite some time ago. It was a little bit too liberal in some areas. I wanted to tighten it down and of course use Report URI to monitor all those reports and see what was going on. So what I wrote about was locking down your website scripts with CSP, hashes, nonces, and Report URI. And what I particularly wanted to talk about is how things like these hashes and nonces work. So to sort of better understand what the content security policy is setting out to do is it's really trying to stop any JavaScript that you didn't write or you didn't intend to run on your site from executing. And the reason is because JavaScript is like the single most powerful thing in the XSS toolkit. If you can get JavaScript, your own arbitrary JavaScript, to run on someone else's website in the context of the user who is currently logged on, so you get JavaScript to execute in their browser, you can do a lot of stuff. Session hijacking, rewriting phishing models and things onto the page, changing where forms post, causing other content to load into the browser. Hey, you've just gone to a website with an XSS vulnerability. It looks like you need to update your Flash player. Don't do that. But look, all of that stuff can be done with JavaScript. And what a content security policy does is it says, we're going to change that fundamentally. So here's where we are at the moment. Here's where 98% of websites are. So 98% of the top 1 million websites don't have a content security policy. Any JavaScript that the browser sees on the page, it'll run. It'll just go, hey, there's script, let's run it. The only exception to that is that browsers do have native XSS defenses. And the way they work is they look for reflected cross-site scripting. So what that means is that if you follow a URL and the URL has got like a script tag and a malicious script in it, and you follow that URL and then that script gets reflected back in the response and executes, the browser will stop that from actually running. And it's able to do that because it can look at the request, it can look at the response, and it can go, this probably shouldn't be running. Now, it can't help you if there's persistent XSS. So if I can get an XSS payload to sit in the database, so for example, I can sign up to a website, leave a comment on the website, and in the comment, I can put a script tag that goes into the database. Everyone who then comes to the website gets that script, executes in their browser. If I could do that, I can cause some serious damage because the browser's native XSS defense doesn't know that that's something from an attacker. It came back from the website. It never went in the request. It was always just sitting there. So the point is that scripts can be enormously dangerous. And what a CSP will do by default is it will say, you cannot run any JavaScript at all. And now what we have to do is we have to start opening up rules to allow just the right things to run. So for example, you might say, okay, no JavaScript at all, but I will allow JavaScript to run if it's served by self. So if it's served by the same website. So you can now go to a website and the only JavaScript can run is, or the only JavaScript that can run is JavaScript in external JS files loaded into the browser. So you can have script source, blah, 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 blah. Right, so that's great. That's one way where we're starting to whitelist things. You can then go on and say, I would like to run JavaScript from www.google.com, because maybe Google Analytics, or Cloudflare's CDN, or New Relic, or other places, and these are all ones I use on Have I Been Pwned. So what you're starting to do is you're starting to say, here are the other places that you're allowed to load a script file in, which is great, and it's this sort of whitelist trusted host kind of approach. Now, the really interesting bit here, and this is really the crux of why I wrote the post, is that by default, you cannot run what is referred to as unsafe inline script. So what that means is you can't have a script block. So you know how you go like script, and then you just put all your JavaScript in there and close script, and then that goes into the HTML of your page? Can't do that. And the reason you can't do it is because that is precisely what attackers try to do. They try to put script blocks on websites, either by reflected XSS or persistent XSS, usually. So you can't run any of that at all. And then suddenly what you realize is you've got these two polar opposites. So you've got the 98% of websites at the moment that can just run any script at all that appears in the actual page. And then you've got the 2% of well, it's not really 2, it'll be less. But you've got some other percentage of websites that have CSPs that can't run anything by default. No inline script at all. You can cause a website using a CSP to run any script by using the unsafe inline keyword. But now you're kind of back to the other problem, which is like any script at all can run. So you see how you got these two polar opposite extremes. And the purpose of this blog post was to talk about hashes and nonces, which give us two middle grounds. So I'll talk about the hashes. The hashes are cool because what you can do, and the easiest way to do this actually is to cause it to fail. So what you can do is say, I would like to have a content security policy on my website. I am going to say that the only place my website can load scripts from is from myself, from my own website. But then I've got a block of script in there. I'm going to load the site anyway, and the content security policy will stop it from running. But it's going to give me an error in my console which says, hey, this isn't allowed to run. And I'll tell you exactly what it says. It'll say something like, refuse to execute inline script because it violates the following content security policy directive, default source self. Either the unsafe inline keyword, which I just touched on, which is the one that turns off all the defenses for running unsafe inline script, a hash. And then what it does is it says SHA-256, and then there's a hash value. So what the browser is actually doing here is it's saying, we have found some unsafe inline script. Normally via a script block, it could also be an on-click event or an on-mouse over event or something as an attribute of another HTML element. So we've found this script that shouldn't have run. This is the SHA-256 hash of the script. What you can now do is you can take the SHA-256 hash and you can add this into your content security policy, which, as you know, if you've been watching, comes down via a response header, usually. Could be a meta tag as well. Normally comes down via a response header. So you can say, I would like to run scripts from self. I would also like to run scripts from, say, Google and New Relic and whatever else. And I would also like to run this hash script, or rather the script which hashes to this value. So you can actually take the error from the console, add it to one of your whitelisted sources, and now to run. And this works defense-wise because you're only going to run exactly that precise script. The attacker can't modify what comes down in the response header. The attacker can only change what's in the page using XSS, because remember, this is the vulnerability we're protecting against. But if the attacker puts their script in there, it won't hash to the same value. And you can go through and add multiple hashes. You might have 3 different script blocks on the page, add 3 different hashes. Now, only those 3 script blocks can run. So this is cool, right? Like, this is sort of extending this whitelist principle. Now, some people then say, yes, but does that mean every single time I change anything in the script block, I've now got to create a new hash? Well, yes, it does, because now what's going to happen is it's going to have a different hash to what it was before. And then some people say, well, what happens if we've got something dynamic in the script block? And first of all, if you do, that's probably something screwy going on, but yeah, let's proceed down that assumption. You've got something dynamic in the script block. So the script itself isn't changing, but every time the page loads, you've got something different in there. You've got, let's say, user ID or something like that. What do I do? Because it's going to hash to a different value. So what you can do is what is explained in the next part of the error, if you just start with default source self, which is where it says, okay, you can use unsafe inline, you can use a hash, or you can use a nonce. Now, a nonce, as many people already know, is a number used once, which doesn't have to be a number, but it just has to be a string which you use once and then discard, and then the next time you need one, you get a different value. It's a pseudo-random value. Now, what the nonce does is it says, what you can do is when the request comes into the web server, you can generate the nonce, this pseudo-random value. You can put that as an attribute on the script tag. So you can have your script block, and then you have an attribute that says nonce equals, and then the value of your nonce, and then that nonce you also put in the CSP response header. So it'll come back and it will say, default source can be self, and mind you, you'd normally be doing script source because you're specifying what scripts you allow. So script source can be self, it can be Google and New Relic, it might be a couple of different hashes like we just discussed, and it's also going to be this nonce value. And it's just a nonce dash prefix and then you put the value. And this is super cool because what you're doing now is you're saying, well, now the browser will trust any script block that has that nonce on it. This protects against the hacker who wants to get their script on your page, because if the hacker tries to put a script block on your page, they won't know what nonce to put on the nonce attribute of the script block. And the reason they won't know is because it's a nonce. They won't know which one is going to come back in the response header when the page actually loads. So this is cool, right? Because we get these multiple layers of defense where you can say, where we are at the moment for 98% of websites, any old script at all can run. And then you can sort of go a little bit further and you can go, well, actually, any script inside this block with the nonce can run. And then you go a little bit further and you say, well, only this precise script with the hash can run. And then you go a little bit further again, which would be you just can't run any unsafe inline script at all. So you can choose how far to lock this thing down. So this is really cool. And go and check that post out. I'll link to it in the bottom here in the notes as well. It's interesting though that there are some nuances here, and there's a bit of a lesson out of all this. One of the things that Scott, who was the founder of Report URI, myself discovered when I was working through this blog post is that some stuff was breaking in Edge. And what we realized is that I had been trying to put a nonce on a script tag with a source attribute. Now you should be able to do this. So think about this. If you want to run, say, what's a good example here? Discuss. You want to run discuss. Now the way you embed discuss is that you're going to have a script tag which says go and get the discuss JavaScript file from the discuss website. You could put the discuss website as a whitelist of your allowable script sources in the header, or at least by the spec, you could put a nonce on the script tag that references that discuss script. The problem is that when you do that last thing, so a nonce with a source on a script tag, Firefox beautiful, Safari beautiful, Chrome beautiful, Edge kind of has a dummy spit. It won't execute it. It doesn't recognize having a nonce on the script tag. And this is a known bug. We actually managed to find an open bug report. We actually got someone from the Edge team, a PM from the Edge team, chime into the Twitter discussion so they know about it, they're fixing it, but it's a bug. And the problem is that when that bug fires for folks using Edge, that script will not load, it will not run, because this is what a CSP is designed to do. It's designed to stop some stuff from running at all, which basically entirely invalidates the whole premise of using a nonce on a script tag that has a source attribute. Edge works fine if it's like a block of script and you put a nonce on and then you've got your JavaScript literally in the page. Doesn't work with embedding external files, which is a bit of a shame because it means that you now have to fall back to the position of saying, well, I've just got a whitelist host, I can't put the nonce anyway. So that's a bit of a problem with Edge. And the thing is, it's not just Edge that's had CSP issues as well. There was a screwy Safari thing where it doesn't recognize what a child source is, which is effectively an iframe, and it needs to use a frame source directive. There was a screwy one in Chrome where Chrome wasn't implementing the CSP when you had a form action that targeted blank. And I know I'm going into a bit of detail here, but I'm trying to sort of illustrate the point that there are some screwy idiosyncrasies. However, this didn't break anything on Have I Been Pwned, because I put this whole thing out there in report-only mode. And this is the cool thing, and this is, I know I'm plugging our service here, but it makes a lot of sense. You can create your entire CSP, and you can say, all I want you to do is just send me reports when stuff breaks. And then you can send the reports to Report URI. And what happens then is that everything will always work perfectly. It's not blocking, it's just reporting. But you get your reports and you monitor your reports and you figure out if things are working properly. And whilst things are not working 100% right, you go through and you tweak your policy until you get it right, which is precisely what I did for Have I Been Pwned. And when I got to the point where I was confident it was right, I removed the report-only bit of the CSP, and now it's enforcing and it's working. And so far I haven't seen any false positives, which is great. But a combination of the fact that it's easy to not realize that your website legitimately needs something from another host that might be blocked, and the fact that some browsers do screwy things means that you've got to use these reports and you've got to monitor them to see when things go wrong. So I know that was a long explanation about CSPs, but I'm really happy with where Have I Been Pwned is now. It's about as strict as I can get it without doing some more re-architecting on a few things, which I may do later on. And again, the sort of lesson out of that was if you look at the reports and you make sure you know what's going on, if something screwy is happening, at least you can fix it and then you can sort of roll over and start enforcing. All right, so that's CSP stuff. I'm going to talk a little bit later on, probably in a subsequent update, around some of the architectural things we've done with Report Your RI as well. But it's been fun trying to handle what is ultimately a billion plus requests a week. So that's cool. The last thing, I've got Terbium Labs sponsoring my blog again this week. They're another organization who's done a heap of sponsorship of troyhunt.com over the period of this year, so I really appreciate their ongoing support. And they've been great as well. They actually do some pretty cool stuff. So go check them out with the link on my blog. And I will actually need to start thinking about sponsorship for the Christmas period and beyond because I'm booked out until then, and then the whole thing is wide open. So I might even write something because this has just been such a good model. I do want to make sure that I keep getting sponsors on there using this model instead of the old ad thing, which was just terrible. So that's it for now. I will come to you next week from Rockhampton and I'll talk to you a little bit about what it's like up there, and I'll talk to you about that super exciting thing that will be happening only a week after that. Thanks very much for watching, everyone.